For more than 100 years, rugby union was the ultimate amateur sport, a spirit enshrined in the laws of the game.
Great work, Billy.
Then, in 3 turbulent months, that entire tradition was overturned.
There was conjecture, there was lies, there were people purporting to be representing people and they were not.
Go, 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 go!
I just said to them, listen, make sure that everything's okay at your end.
I knew, come hell or high water, we would have to change to fight that off.
This was, from our point of view, total war.
Just because money comes into a game, it doesn't mean it's going to fall apart.
In 1995, one small group of determined men almost managed to steal rugby. And another group, the rugby unions, managed to save it. Rupert Murdoch's Super League raid opened hostilities. The flashy new breakaway competition was an attempt to hijack Kerry Packer's hold on rugby league. But the immediate impact was on the players. Their market value multiplied instantly, a direct threat to the amateur ethos of rugby union.
The amount of money they were offering players, rugby league players, to increase their salaries by 3 and 4 times and so on, was very threatening to us.
To see Super League arrive, and that supercharged money start to really hit the market out there, I thought it was a really huge threat to the game.
I thought, gee, there's not enough decent players for 1 rugby league competition, let alone 2. Where are they going to look? Rugby, so hello.
We were worried about it, absolutely worried, that Super League could really harm rugby. I was worried.
Something was going to bust at some stage. Either it needed to move to professionalism or they needed to take the pressure off the players. And of course it did bust.
Gregan.
In truth, rugby had lost its purity long before. In Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, the best players were already being paid.
Everybody knew that South Africans got money in the amateur days, but it wasn't vast amounts of money. People always thought that you could sustain a living. You couldn't. It was there for a beer and a good night out.
94, I think it had probably progressed to a situation where we could pay majority of the squad. The blokes who had played the whole season probably up towards $30,000, which was getting close to the average wage in those days.
Yeah, sure, some of us were getting paid and some of us weren't. But at the end of the day, we still had to produce it on the track.
They're trying with Bicknell at the moment.
In their haste to fend off Super League, the unions now rush to abandon the same principles they had been upholding for more than a century.
A declaration was made by the New South Wales Rugby Union and the Queensland Rugby Union, the Australian Rugby Union and the New Zealand Rugby Union. Rugby is no longer an amateur game. That was enunciated to the world.
We were of the view that the game was a sham and that it had to regain its honesty and become an open game.
The time has come for us to realise that we cannot ask the players to put so much time and their own money and their bodies on the line for nothing.
Kerry Packer had retained a Sydney investment firm to advise him in his Super League fight with Murdoch. But one of their executives saw the raid more as an opportunity than a threat.
I thought it wasn't such a great idea to fight this Murdoch on the Super League thing, but actually take the opportunity to do exactly the same thing out of rugby union, which was actually much more valuable because of its international ability.
It was World Series cricket all over again. Back in the 70s, Packer had brought up all the best players, sidestepped the officials, and captured the game. Why not use that same strategy to grab rugby?
When we approached the Packer organisation as a potential business venture, they were very enthusiastic. And basically what they said to us, they liked it all in principle, but they didn't think it was possible to pull off. But if we could deliver the players and if we could bring them the fact that it would be an interesting product for international TV and we could show some commitment and some plan of action for it, they would be keen to then go the next stage.
But Levy, originally from South Africa, knew he wasn't the right man to recruit players around the world. His choice for that role sat in another office at the other end of town.
He immediately rang me and he said, Roscoe, he said, I've told Packer that he should take rugby professional, and his men have said, give us a scheme. Can you get me a scheme? I said, of course. He said, what do you think about it? And I said, mate, this is, this is what I was born for. This is, with all the background I have, I'd be absolutely delighted to be involved in this.
Ross Turnbull had the credentials for the task, but he also had baggage. As a prop forward, he'd played just one test as a Wallaby against Ireland in 1968. Then, moving into administration, Turnbull's lasting monument was Concord Oval, a failed development in Western Sydney that pushed New South Wales rugby to the brink of bankruptcy. But the past never troubles Ross Turnbull.
You never look back. Whatever's happened, I can do nothing about in life. The game, and I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. The game's today.
The scheme Turnbull and Levy cobbled together was for an international competition with franchise teams. They'd need to buy up more than 500 players. Their original pitch gained some limited Packer funding, and the corporate name they chose matched their grand ambitions.
That is a genius name. The World Rugby Corporation. It sounded like a 75-storey building in New York or London or Paris or Sydney or whatever. It sounded serious, the World Rugby Corporation. They could have called it 3 Men and a Dog, plus $1 million seed money from Kerry Packer, but it wouldn't have had the same impact.
We had to have a plan that the leaders of the teams, the coaches and the players, understood would work and would be enthusiastic about.
I heard rumours about it from mutual friends and so on who said, I should be careful about Ross because he had some aspirations.
There were little whiffs of things, nothing really concrete in the beginning, but we began to realise that something was on.
At its core, the WRC strategy was theft. Sign up all the best players and the unions would soon be powerless. But to succeed, it would also have to be kept secret.
If they were going to embrace it, as indeed the cricketers, if they were going to embrace it, they didn't need to be telling anybody. And once they'd totally embraced it, then we could have some serious discussions with the officials.
The men who at that stage were the gatekeepers of the establishment of rugby, they had nothing to gain by this occurring. They would have been felt threatened, as they were, and they would have attacked it from day one, so you wouldn't have been able to get to that point to take it to that level.
Murdoch had launched Super League to generate premium sports programming for News Corporation's pay television outlets. Now, the union saw News Corporation as the most likely source for the dollars they'd need to take their game professional. Murdoch ran his international TV operations from London. The boss there was a former Australian television tyro, Sam Chisholm. Getting through his door would need help.
I got involved in trying to get them together to present a package which would be something that News Corporation would pay a lot of money for.
I think that all sport is, you can't beat it in broadcasting. It's extremely valuable. How do you put a price on these things? They're very hard to do.
Myself and a colleague, we locked ourselves away in a hotel room in South Africa for several days and tried to run numbers and what this might be and what that might be. And we came to a number, and then I remember on a flight back to England or back to Australia, I can't remember where I decided to double it.
With Ian Frickberg, whatever the price is, it's going to always be a pretty good ask. So you always know there's a bit of freeboard there.
The union's proposal was massive. A Super 12 and Tri-Nations format to give News Corporation thousands of hours of elite rugby broadcasting. But Chisholm would have to agree the price.
I gave him the document and, you know, it went through all the deal as we saw it, and at the end it said, you know, price, and the price was 650 million US, and so I watched him go through it and came to the price and said, huh, we're not paying that.
You know, if it had been $1, I would have said, look, this is preposterous, or something like that. I would have started rolling around the floor doing that sort of stuff.
So I said, well, you know, you'll have to pay something close to that, Sam, because that's what it's worth. And that was the start of the negotiation.
As we were leaving, he sort of said this thing about, well, you know, this wasn't a bad meeting, was it? And we all said, oh, of course, Sam, no, you're great, you know. And he said, there's one thing in this place. We don't have good cop, bad cop. We just have bad cop and worse cop.
What now unfolded was a bizarre battle between media moguls. The Murdoch and Packer interests were both rushing to control the same football code, but they chased that prize from opposite ends. Their paths crossed at the Rugby World Cup in South Africa. A perfect recruiting opportunity for WRC.
Super League scouts have been joined in South Africa by former Wallaby Ross Turnbull, who's been linked with a breakaway pro-rugby tournament.
While the unions negotiated with News Corporation in London, the best players on the planet and their coaches were now all gathered in South Africa, ripe for the picking. Ross Turnbull had set up his centre of operations at the Sandton Sun, the most luxurious hotel in Johannesburg. Money was apparently no object, and Turnbull's suite became the WRC recruiting office.
The only players I ever spoke to, from my personal point of view, were the captains. And I can never forget to this day this knock on the door, and there is this magnificent physical specimen.
He explained to me the whole concept, which I found fascinating. It really was a professional setup. It made a lot of sense.
He said, well, William, that's fantastic. Let's be part of it. And he agreed then to be our agent, and agreed then to go out and sign up all his players and do whatever he needed to do.
That tactic of using captains and senior officials as recruiting agents was inspired, and it soon yielded results.
Quite a few of the guys have been up to a meeting with the WRC guys, and they wanted to see me later in the day. And that was honestly the first that I'd heard about it. So yeah, sure, I went and had a listen, and that was the start of it, really.
We had a senior official from the Australian team sort of approach us, a few of the senior players, and say that this was on. It seems like it's got merit, and if you blokes want to run on with it, that's your decision.
Every one of the Wallabies and a bunch of players underneath, and probably a bunch of players underneath, would all get paid. And for the amount of effort that was required to put in to be world class, they had to be paid.
For me, it was something that they looked at very seriously, and we went back to the hotel. We had a team meeting along with the coaches, and we discussed it. And everyone said, right, let's take this down the road and just see where it takes us.
The thing that didn't appeal to me was that we would have to break away from the union. So that was a tough call.
While WRC was using the World Cup to intensify its recruiting, the Wallabies lost a nail-biting quarter-final to England. Meanwhile, the tournament itself was dominated by an extraordinary new superstar.
This is a game between the All Blacks and England, and I had said to Rupert Murdoch, you should have a look at this game. This is going to be sort of the day of days where, you know, the Empire was going to sort of strike back, and Loman came out and decimated everything in about 10 minutes. Murdoch rang me and said, heavens, this is amazing. This man is, you know, extraordinary, and we must, you know, we must get this guy organised.
Rupert, what's that big fast man? What's that big fast man's name? Oh, I said, General Omu. That's it. Get him.
And within days, the deal was done. Louis Late flew to London, representing all 3 Southern Hemisphere unions. Frickberg took him to Chisholm's apartment to finalise the agreement.
We turn up there and we have, this is for the final negotiation with the anointed one, who was Louis and Sam, and they sit down and the figure gets put on the table, 550, and Sam says, we'll pay 550, and Louis says, very good, one more thing.
And I said, Sam, please, I can't accept that. I need a bit more. I need a bit more. He said, what do you want more? I said, 5 million. He says, you have it, 5 million.
So Sam says, OK, we pay 555. Very good. And that's the deal done.
He said, all right, I got to speak to the big man. And we said, OK. He said, you go and have lunch.
So we go to the Carlton Towers in London, which is a renowned rib place.
And we ordered magnificent beef and a bottle of very expensive French wine. I was certain that everything was going to go right.
And I rang Murdoch, because obviously I needed his approval. And I said to him, look, this rugby deal is now at the point where we can sign a deal. Murdoch said, get it signed. So I said, fine. So that's when I rang Ian and Louis and said, you better get back here and sign it.
Lovely big steak arrives and Louis is just tucking into, I think he might have had 2 mouthfuls, and the phone call comes. And Sam says, well, Bardo, you better come now and sign now. It's got to be signed now. I said, well, can't we just finish our lunch? No, you better come now. You know, these things are like, you better strike now, this will go.
I said, tell him we'll be there in half an hour. He says, no, he wants us there now.
So we sort of put the old knife and fork down, leave these steaks uneaten, and off we go round to his flat.
I initialed every page, he initialed every page, the 3 pages, and we signed, he signed, and we shook hands.
It'd have to be one of the greatest reliefs, I suppose, in my entire life when you think about the effort that went into it by so many people for such a long time, and it was such a large sum of money that when it happened, it was a huge, there was a great feeling of joy and relief.
Clearly, at that time, amateur rugby was finished at the elite level, and now we move on to a professional era.
I was ecstatic. I thought, well, now we've got this this money. We're right. We can see these Super League and Australian Rugby League people off.
But the unions had been worried about the wrong enemy. The WRC Raiders were making enormous progress, still in secret, even on the day before the World Cup final at Ellis Park. Unaware of their plight, the unions proudly assembled the international media to announce a brave new world.
We were all gathered there on the eve of the World Cup final, and there are the 3 chairmen of the board of Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and they announced this thing.
The significance of this agreement is that it provides these 3 unions with a platform on which to develop the sport of rugby union into the next century.
And I think I asked the question, which was, is this the formal end of all notion of amateurism? And Louis Late absolutely denied it.
The players will not be paid to play rugby.
Well, with that amount of money, you ain't going to be spending it on goalposts and shorts, mate. You know, where do you think it's going to go?
I can't tell you right now, but everybody will benefit, every aspect will benefit from this deal.
That was the moment of we are taking this in an entirely different direction.
That was a great deal for Murdoch and a poor deal for rugby, because we worked it out. I mean, how could this really, for 10 years, for only that sort of money, this is what they've got? It just didn't seem to me that it was a very good deal.
The South African Rugby Union signed heads of agreement, 550 million US dollars to turn the game professional, but they didn't speak to the players. So they already put financial frameworks in place to take the game professional without speaking to the players. So the players were left in the lurch.
Stransky, the attempt to drop goal. It's there.
South Africa's triumph in the final put the value of Southern Hemisphere rugby beyond doubt.
Ellis Park erupts. South Africa are the world champions of rugby.
The players had become precious commodities, and the scramble to secure their signatures was on in earnest. As a reward for winning the Cup, the South African Rugby Union gave their players and families a short holiday at Sun City. The resort was built during the apartheid era as a way to sidestep international sanctions. Now the Springbok captain seized the moment to secretly sign up his team.
I had to bring the guys into my room in groups. So I sat down with them. I talked them through the finances. I talked them through the whole structure, and I asked them in principle if they're interested, and they said yes, and all of them signed. And I told them that if they wanted out, they must phone me and I'll tear up the contract. So then I had all the contracts signed, waiting for the right moment to hand it over to the agent on behalf of Ross Turnbull in South Africa.
Amidst the opulence of Sun City, the huge salaries being promised by WRC, up to $300,000 a year, didn't seem out of place. But if the new competition wasn't a reality by November, just 5 months away, then all those contracts were void. And as the players celebrated their good fortune, there was another aspect of the deal known only to very few.
The murkiest part of the whole thing is the whole success fee thing. Now, unbeknownst to the players, there is this whole thing of, with the captains, you will get a certain return, success fee, if you can get all your players signed up.
It had to be done from within, so we had to persuade or convince the leaders, natural leaders, whether they be captains or coaches of the various teams around the country, to be involved with us. And of course, it was a professional exercise, and there was an incentive, yeah.
It wasn't the case of, let's go and sign up this bloke and I'll get 15% of the cut of whatever the bloke's contract was. It just wasn't like that.
I didn't want that pressure on me to, you know, that I'd get an extra whatever for signing the whole team, and that was never the case. And I can quite categorically say that I was paid no money by WRC.
As captain and business arrangement, there was a fee for acting as an agent, which Harry Viljoen, the coach then, and Ross Turnbull offered.
It was talked about, if this thing gets up and happening, then yes, there could be a success fee down the track. What the success fee was I don't even know if it was a lot of money or not.
Whatever the promises were, they worked. The Springboks had already signed. The All Blacks would sign with WRC on their return to New Zealand. Most of the Wallabies and scores of Australia's best regional players were being swiftly recruited. Yet still, none of their unions knew.
Effectively, it was a takeover bid, and the timing couldn't be better because the players were not under contract. They were not secure, and they obviously are the key asset.
And obviously, we had to be careful what we said. We had signed a confidentiality contract, so we couldn't talk about it.
They were able to get to the players, swear them to secrecy, bind the players up, keep it from the rugby unions, and they knew nothing. The unions knew nothing about it.
But nothing in rugby stays secret for long. As news of the defections began to leak out, the unions confronted a potential disaster. They now had $555 million, but no players.
Once they discovered we had the contracts, that's when it really got tough, because in terms of the inverted commas war, because they wouldn't have been able to deliver without the players.
Yeah, we knew we didn't have the players contracted, but we thought money was all that it would take.
And of course, you know, this is the way with these things. Everybody's, you know, full of all this platitudinous, oh yeah, it'll all be okay, you know, because their mind at that stage is, you know, befuddled because they've got this deal.
And News, of course, had made it very clear, and it was part of the contract we did with News, or part of the heads of agreement, that we clearly had to have the top players in the country. If we lost the players, we lost the News contract.
And quite frankly, you know, they hadn't, for a moment, thought through what turned out to be their nightmare.
Kerry Packer chose precisely this moment to pounce. For the price of a few extra million, he now acquired control of WRC. The opportunity to undermine Murdoch, his lifetime media rival, was irresistible.
For him, $1 million or $2 or $3 was nothing. It was a thing of getting pressure points on the body politic of the Murdoch organisation.
We entered into a proper option agreement with them. There was $5 million of further seed money put in to go the next few steps.
It was an astute move by Packer to have control of the raw material that Murdoch needed for his pay television outfits.
But it happened right under my nose. And I had to go to Australia to be warned that this is happening here.
Another crisis, another airline flight. Ian Frickberg, worried that the deal he'd brokered for the unions was now unravelling, called them all together in Sydney.
We all went down to the rugby union offices and we sat there and I said that we had a crisis.
Frickberg said, there's a problem, Packer's involved.
And then Louis said, how do you know this? And I said, well, we've spoken to players. And he said, well, how do you talk to our players? I said, well, you know, someone's going to have to talk to them. And he said, we have no crisis, just hang on.
I said, wait, and I said, can I use your phone? And I phoned.
Then after a little, we have a crisis.
So they weren't able to deliver. And so that's not something that, you know, somebody like me takes lightly in a very, in a transactional business, you know, it's absolutely critical that everybody, you know, sticks to their word.
Yes, Sam was not a happy man. I mean, and you know, that was very understandable. This contract had been concluded, enormous amount of money, and you know, where are the players?
And unless you've had Sam Chisholm have a crack at you, it is unbelievable. I can remember Sam saying to me at one stage, listen here, you effing liquidator, if you don't get your effing ass off the car seat, I was in my car at that stage, and start doing something about this, I will sue your pants off.
Oh, Sam read the riot act, jumped up and down and said a lot of things he probably shouldn't have said.
And then he turned on to me. He said, you said, trust me. I said, listen, can we just stop there? I said, you don't talk to me like that.
Yeah, I certainly would have been offensive to him, personally. There'd be no question about that.
Don't you ever shout at me. And then he calmed down.
I wasn't very happy about the whole situation. So, yeah, I wouldn't have left him in any doubt. I would have undoubtedly given him a piece of my mind.
Good space here for New Zealand. Lomu, an early touch.
The following day, the day of the Bledisloe Cup test in Sydney, became a turning point in the rugby war. The media were now openly reporting defections to WRC.
Lomu and Campisi. Lomu! Unstoppable!
For many players, this might be their last game in national colours. It could even be the last test of all.
Normally after a game, the spectators disperse quickly, particularly if you've lost the game. But I looked around and the place was full, and we both addressed a full crowd.
This is the end of the season, and in many ways it's the end of an era. Let me say this, that sort of spectacular, passionate game between two nations is something that money can't buy.
I thought he said it extremely well, actually, and I think the rest of the crowd did, because there was enormous applause that went with it.
Phil's comment required a retort, and I guess, you know, if I try and think back to the moment, I think I did weigh up in my own mind, should I say nothing or should I say something? But in the emotion of just losing a test match, I thought, bugger it, I'll have a go.
To all the Australian supporters here today, we thank you. It's been terrific, your support. And whatever happens in the future, we hope that you and the union support us. Thank you very much.
They were fairly moderate words.
And whatever happens in the future, we hope that you and the union support us.
But at the time, in the atmosphere of that stadium, it was, boom, it's true. These bastards are going to go. They've done the dirty. They've signed the stuff. They're off.
It made me angry. I really was, and people around me felt angry as well and thought, what's happening here?
This was sign upon the sign that the top-level international players had gone.
We were at the end of the road, one way or the other, whichever way it was going to go. So it was pretty highly charged.
The New Zealanders were buoyed by their win, but they still had some extra business to conclude that night. Straight after the match, the team was expected at a special dinner marking 100 Trans-Tasman tests. They'd be late.
Well, all these All Blacks who had just finished a tough Bledisloe Cup went and had a shower. I got on the bus, but the bus took a bit of a deviation into the eastern suburbs, up the S-Bends, round past Rose Bay.
Where they'd gone, we subsequently found out, was to Brian Power's house, who was then heading Kerry Packer's operation.
It was quite an interesting scene, and they all went downstairs together, and their lawyers were there, and put the contracts, and they all sat in the basement and had a chit-chat for about an hour to make sure that's really what they wanted to do, and sign, and they all signed the contracts, etc., etc.
We hopped on the bus, we drove around to Brian Power's, and Jeff presented to us, and then we hopped back on the bus and went back to the function.
Yeah, when I look back, I kind of see Fitzpatrick as a kind of a shadowy figure around that time. Out front to the media and to people like myself, the dealings with him were excellent. But behind the scenes, he was one of the leaders that was trying to manoeuvre the top players into the big money that was on offer from WRC.
I think so. It's not for me to say, but I think some of the guys signed up. Yeah, that's for sure.
They were signing themselves out of rugby on a bus that we were paying for. You know, it wasn't very impressive, I got to tell you.
As guests arrived at the centenary dinner that night, they walked into a room buzzing with suspicion and animosity. What was meant to be the setting for grand celebrations had become a battleground.
There were some people there who couldn't look us in the eye, which was disappointing. And I don't mean just players, people who were getting involved. It was a fairly icy atmosphere. Regrettably, it wasn't the warm atmosphere that one would have liked to celebrate such an occasion.
You could have put a knife through the atmosphere in the night. Both teams there, many of the ex-Wallabies through many eras were there. A lot of people didn't really understand what was going on. Some in the know did.
And I hope that you past players here tonight will give honest and good advice to the current players as you mixed amongst them in considering the future of our game as these players now focus on their personal decisions.
By now, the rebel raids were common knowledge. Yet the unions still didn't realise how deeply WRC had been able to penetrate their ranks.
A friend of mine, who was a friend of Phil's, came up to me during the course of the dinner and said, Ian, Phil's just told me that he's signed up with WRC. Bear in mind that for the 2 or 3 weeks before that, we had chosen not to do anything at the request of people like Phil. So I felt physically sick in that environment because I just thought I've been had.
It was probably the worst dinner I've ever had. I've never had such a bad case of indigestion. It lasted for some months.
For the unions, this was their lowest point. One more injection of funds into WRC could now destroy them. Back in Wellington, the New Zealand Rugby Union confronted the depth of their crisis. They'd accepted that the players would have to be paid, but more than a century of cherished All Black tradition was now in peril. WRC were the barbarians at their gate.
I was really concerned. I was concerned about what it might mean for international rugby, but more particularly for what it might mean for New Zealand rugby.
And at that stage, the New Zealand Rugby Union said, Jock, you've got to come onto this committee that we're forming and get the All Black players to stay with us.
There was just so much that needed to be done, and it needed to be done in a real hurry.
The union's strategy in New Zealand was simple. Get out and meet with every player they'd need face to face.
Jock did a phenomenal job crisscrossing the country, trying to persuade the players. By then we could give them the detail of what Super 12 would look like, how the Tri-Nations would work and that sort of thing, and more detail on the contracts.
It was 5 weeks, sometimes up to 17 hours a day that Hobbs worked, going up and down the country. Coming out of airports with a cell phone in his ear, pushing his way past the media, into a car, speeding away, going into hotels, same thing, talking, followed by his assistants.
We had a good case. We had a good alternative, and players needed to be aware of that so that they could make an informed decision. We had the money. It wasn't something that was fictional. It was, in fact, real. I can remember saying, we have the ding.
At one point I thought, Christ, where's the money coming from if they all sign it? So I rang Sam and said, you know, we need $5 million. You got it! So at least we knew we had the money.
Money was never a problem in South Africa. The issue here was loyalty. As fans waited for the new season, the nation was still ignorant of an unthinkable rift within the rugby fraternity.
We were like a family. I was the father and they were my kids. I mean, I used to have them in my home for dinners before a game.
Leight treated these boys like these Springboks, gods, like schoolboys. I mean, one boy came in, McDonald, and the biggest back row I've ever seen in my life, and he was crying. He'd been at a session with Leight and he was crying.
If they go to bed at night, they must think that they've sold out their countries by saying that they will go with Turnbull. Because in New Zealand, the All Black didn't mean a thing. The Wallaby didn't mean a thing. The Springbok didn't mean a thing. To me, that's unforgivable.
You're doing a job, somebody else comes along, offers you a lot more money to come and do exactly the same job in exactly the same format under a professional structure. Are you going to say, no, thank you, I'm not going to listen to you? So that was basically how it panned out.
We decided at the time the way to really break this up, to destroy its credibility, was to take South Africa out of the equation. Hence, there was a huge number of phone calls through the night between myself and Sam, Ian, to track down Francois.
I was out of my depth. Here I am. I'm a dumb Dutchman. I mean, I'm meeting these guys. I've been being phoned in the middle of the night by henchmen left and right saying to me, be careful of this guy, watch out for that guy. And all of a sudden, you know, you don't know who to believe.
As a result, we started to have meetings with entire teams, meeting, video conferencing with the key All Blacks, video conferencing with the key Springboks. We even had a video conference with all three, so that everybody knew they were all for one, one for all.
This is Australia talking, even though there's a South African accent, so excuse that for a moment.
At that conference was Brian Powers, Kerry Packer's chief executive, David Leckie, his #1 television man, Tony Gregg from the cricket, Jeff Levy, who was, in a sense, acted for him. I mean, we had a bit of firepower there.
You know, a lot of people around the world have relied on you guys hanging tough, and we want to give you all the support we can in making sure you do that.
Okay, we've got 60 players signed, sealed and delivered. Everyone at the moment, I mean, the only point that we're reiterating to everyone is just that we've got to stay together and stick together and don't budge on that.
Then we linked up with New Zealand and there they were, the Kiwi players, and that was fantastic.
So our position now is that we've rolled our dice, that we've said that we're into this and we're totally behind it. I don't think anyone has any illusions about the pressure that you guys are going to be put under. I know everyone in South Africa is feeling that pressure right now.
I think now's probably a good time to hear a bit from South Africa to see that that you guys are strong like the rest of the world.
And then we linked up with South Africa. Where's Francois?
I think you're cut out. We can't hear you.
Firstly, I'd just like to make apologies for Francois not being here.
Francois didn't turn up, and the conference was pathetic from South Africa's point of view.
It definitely sent a message that there was a split in the camp, in their camp. And if they were like us, we were saying, OK, well, South Africa is not going to be there. And if South Africa wasn't going to be there, it was very unlikely that New Zealand was going to be there, that's for sure.
Oh, not happy. Not happy. You know, at a crucial time when a captain should be showing leadership, he dived out the window.
Pienaar's absence was a body blow to WRC. Why hadn't he come? The answer lay in a persuasive phone call from Chisholm the night before.
Sam phoned me in the middle of the night saying to me, "You're the captain. We know what is happening."
And I said to him, "You've got to show some leadership here. You are the captain. You are the holders of the World Cup, right? And it is incumbent on you, right, to show some leadership."
I was asked by Chisholm, as a sign of faith, not to go to the meeting. We would put exactly the same offer on the table, but as a sign of faith, would you not go to the meeting? And I thought, it's only a video link-up. I mean, it's not the end of the world if I'm not there.
No man came under more pressure than Francois Pienaar, who had promised himself to the WRC and then was absolutely placed under extraordinary pressure from the union and from the Murdoch crowd to buckle, and buckle he did.
Those guys would not have a clue of what happened in South Africa. It was a very difficult situation. Looking from their side, they would say, no, that guy, he disappointed us. And I would have felt the same if I were them.
But for the Springboks and their captain, the decisive factor was money. Pienaar could now assure them that News Corporation would match their WRC contracts. And while the unions already had Murdoch's millions, all the WRC could offer were promises.
If you're going to go out and get the top, 100 rugby players in Australia, 100 rugby players in South Africa, 100 rugby players in New Zealand, or whatever the number might be, and you say to them, come on, sign exclusive contracts to us, we're going to do our own tour, the World Rugby Corporation, then you have to have a heap of money.
Did we really dig deeply and do our due diligence on how much was going to be there? Probably not. Did we have faith in the people that were behind where the money was going from? Yes, we did.
That's probably the most surprising to me of all the things that happened, that they didn't have people check whether the finances were really there, but they were prepared to accept the promise of large sums of money. There were no bona fides to the WRC group.
The real reasons for people signing, it was obviously to get their own hands on some money. Where's that money going to come from? Where is it going to come from? And a lot of the negative feedback from establishment was there is no money.
Whereas we, the rugby union, at that stage had developed a plan called Tri-Nations and Super 12, where we could offer real money because we had the News Limited contract in the bag, you might say, to the players and continue with the traditional aspect of rugby.
Well, it would have been better if Kerry Packer had said, look, boys, here's $100 million, put that in your bank account and let's go. Well, that wasn't the way businesses played. We had to have a significant number of players signed up to activate our contract.
The unions had finally isolated the World Rugby Corporation's flaw. In New Zealand, players who a month earlier had signed with WRC were now having second thoughts.
As the time went by, a few of them might have started thinking, well, we haven't seen the cheque in the mail yet. Nothing had come through.
And we felt that if we could get some senior players to break ranks, then, maybe the rest would come too.
And that breakthrough wasn't long in coming. In New Zealand, Jock Hobbs' hard work was finally being rewarded.
I am holding letters from lawyers acting for Jeff Wilson and Josh Kronfeld, confirming that these two All Blacks will sign contracts with the New Zealand Rugby Football Union.
They signed, we announced it. The next day, instead of me making calls, I was getting calls. I knew the landscape had changed quite significantly.
The landscape was also shifting 2 continents to the west. The Springboks assembled at a hotel halfway between Pretoria and Johannesburg. Down payments promised to the players by WRC hadn't arrived. It was time to choose sides.
There were almost three propositions, but the two most important ones were the South African Rugby Unions and WRC, and we asked the guys to vote. And the majority voted to go with the union.
In Australia, the issues were not so clear-cut. The players gathered at a Sydney hotel to resolve their confusions. WRC recruiting had been widespread, but some key Wallabies remained loyal to the union. Sticking with the rebels could now mean giving up the precious Australian jersey forever.
So rather than force anyone to go through with it, the best thing to do was to get everyone together and hear both sides of the story.
To help them through that maze, the Wallaby captain enlisted expert advice, but from an unlikely source.
I got James Erskine, who was a personal friend, and I said to James, mate, tell it how it is, not on the ARU side of things. I want the facts.
I don't know what he was expecting. I think he probably was expecting something slightly more mild in the sense of the balance. But I mean, there was no balance. It's a bit like saying, do you want to go and work for somebody who has got this amount of money in the bank, can afford it, has all the commercial rights here, or do you want to go and work with this group who promised you the world but haven't got a brass razoo?
And he spoke and came out and just absolutely attacked the WRC concept, the background, the financial backing and everything. And which is his, you know, they were allowed to put up an argument. And basically it was their great sell job against our not so great sell job.
He's an exceptionally good negotiator and businessman, and James would do what would be the best business deal for his company which he was representing.
My job was to make sure that the ARU won, really. Let's be truthful about it.
I was not speaking to them as a representative of the ARFU or IMG. Phil Kearns asked me, with my knowledge in sport, etc., to give them both sides, and that's what I did.
In truth, Erskine gave them both barrels. He demolished the WRC proposals, and Australia's best players took the hint.
I was able to say to Phil Kearns after that meeting that we've got 11 or 12 players signed up, and that was the truth. And Phil said to me, if that's the case, it's all over.
That was a major blow. So, one, you've got the Springboks not being there. Two, you've got, say, 5 key All Blacks pulling out. And at that point, you could see the walls starting to crumble.
At that point, the game was over. We could have maybe gone and in fact, Ross did attempt on his own to go and look for other backers and all this stuff. But the game was over.
For the Packer organisation, this was the moment to cut their losses. The bad news was delivered in person by the Wallaby captain.
I organised to have a chat with Brian Powers. We got together in Park Street, and I said to Brian, I said, in all honesty, I think we're pushing it uphill here, you know, without South Africa, etc. I mean, at the end of the day, those were the guys that were funding it. And I said, I think we're pushing it uphill. And he said, I think you're right.
Brian Power, I mean, I had meetings with Brian, and to the extent, and I said, look, what are you going to do? Are you going to throw $300 million at this thing or not? And he basically said, no, we're not. So I knew that it was not going to happen.
Bit by bit, the establishment, the rugby unions, moved forward and forward and forward until they won the day. And the reason they won the day is because in the ammo that they were using, the rugby unions were using real money.
By now, Ross Turnbull was a dead man walking. With a legal challenge lost, the elite players gone, and Packer out of the equation, he suddenly broke cover to spruik his doomed cause on South African television.
Ross, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. This story, 30 players from these 5 test unions have signed up. Can you confirm that?
And it was terrific. They were very fair to me, and they'd done their homework. They really had, they understood all the issues. Then they had a talkback session.
We've got a surprise caller on the line now, Mr. Turnbull. Louis Late has just called us. Hello, Dr. Late, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Ross, let me just say to you, you couldn't prove to us that you had any $100 million or $200 million because that's what you will need. You need $52 million to just sign up the South African players.
And then I said, look, Louis, now if you got all that off your chest, I said, what you and I need to do is sit down and probably over lunch or dinner and get all this sorted out.
It is very important for the future of world rugby.
Ross, let me be very candid with you. I don't want ever to sit down with you.
And I said, we don't want you here. We don't want you now, rugby. Ross, go back to Australia. We don't need you here.
Dr. Leith, thank you very much for calling us on Talking Sport tonight. We do appreciate it. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, Ross.
And WRC's time was running out as well.
The most valuable autograph the New Zealand Rugby Union has ever collected. The All Black captain's handshake with the chairman signalling the end of rugby's contracts war.
The end was swift and simple. Press conferences in each country confirmed the capitulation. The players would get a huge slice of the News Corporation money. The unions got to keep their game.
Jeff Levy, myself and Ian Ferrier sat down at a press conference and sort of announced the truce and the way forward.
The best result is when we call it a win-win. And I think we'd like you to understand that we all around this table feel we've reached that win-win situation.
At the end of the day, X number of rugby players had done a great deal with the AIU. There was no real blood on the floor.
WRC was without question a catalyst in the negotiations between the Australian Rugby Union and the players. And if it's content with that, and it is, then it hasn't lost anything.
They were able to forge a deal that was bloody good for the rugby union players. Not necessarily the best thing for rugby itself, but a fabulous deal for the players.
All I can say is, you know, we're all friends, we all know each other, we know this was done with absolute the bona fides of making it what was best for rugby.
The players and the Australian Rugby Union and WRC have achieved something which will spread, we hope, around the world.
So it was a great outcome, and I remember at the end of that press conference, they sort of said, OK, everyone, press conference finished, cameras over, and I leaned across to Jeff and Ian and said, let's go and have a beer. And we did.
Picked up by Atherton to Christian Cullen.
Behind the public truce, the rugby war ended in total defeat for the WRC.
A dozen phases, surely.
But for the players, there was still some unfinished business. Their opportunity came the next time the All Blacks met South Africa.
This is a fantastic attack and defence job by both sides.
There was an incident at the bottom of a ruck. Pienaar was down on the ground.
Francois Pienaar in real trouble.
He still thinks that we got him, but there was never any malice. I don't even know how, because we have this discussion every time I see him.
I actually, every test match against New Zealand is always physical, and this is just a rugby anecdote.
He's had enough of this game, says the doctor to the referee, and the stretcher has come out.
No, there was no, within our camp, there was never any malice to get Frankie Pienaar, that's for sure.
They put a brace on him around his neck and they carried him off.
And what an ovation ringing around this famous ground for the Springbok captain.
And I asked him, Fitzy, did you, when we played our last test match at Newlands, were you the guy that kicked me in the head? He said, mate, we were all lining up to kick you in the head. So I can't take credit for that.
It's been a spectacular success for the game. It's been a spectacular success for the players, for the viewers, the broadcasters, the public, everybody.
Sometimes it sort of irks me if people mention the word circus or when people didn't really understand what it was about.
I then and still today refer to it as World Rugby Circus. The only thing that was missing probably were the animals. There were plenty of clowns around.
It was an interesting period in my life. I got to learn the other side of the game, I suppose, and see the other side of people.
We don't know what would have happened. Let's assume that Packer was involved and every structure was in place. I would have been interested to see how this would pan out.
We had a plan. And we knew it was a great plan. And we knew it was the future of the game. And it is the future of the game. They just haven't done it yet.